I think if you're a kid into any sort of mythology, when you learn about fossils for the first time, you, or at least I, assume that they must have impacted each other. Fossils must have inspired mythology, or fossils must have proved mythology right to some. And doing some research, it turns out pretty much, yeah. And there are some really, really cool stories, so without further ado. The Mediterranean used to be a land connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia, and it was populated by many great prehistoric animals: elephants, giraffes, tigers, mastodons, and mammoths, oh my. And when their fossils emerged, the people on the shores and the islanders told amazing stories. One is about a fossil being ascribed a myth about Artemis, who sent a wild boar to ravage the land. It was eventually slain by a party of heroes, and then the tusks of the, quote, Caledonian boar were taken as trophies and held in a temple in Tegea until 31 BCE, when it was taken by the soon-to-be Roman Emperor Augustus, who displayed them in Rome. And these were real tusks. A guy named Pausanias visited Rome to see the tusks, and one had crumbled away, but the remaining one was 3 foot long, and these were likely the remains of a woolly mammoth due to the curvature that was also described. And it makes sense that they assumed it was from a giant boar because, I mean, that was the only tusked animal they were really aware of. And talking of mammoths, I'm gonna take the words directly from Adrian Mayer, who said, quote, "Imagine you're a Greek farmer ploughing your field in the 8th century BC, and suddenly you find some impossibly huge bone sticking out of the ground. You notice the thigh bone and compare it to yourself. You may have found a mammoth skeleton, but if you lived at the time of Homer, you would know nothing of elephants. Gazing at the enormous leg bone, you might visualize a strange two-legged giant." And just look at the image of the rearranged mammoth skeleton included in the article. I love it. And this idea of mammoth bones as remains of giants is pervasive. For example, in ancient Greece, there were 2 places that had so many huge bones that they were known as battlefields, where Zeus and the other gods had slain many giants. The area around Megalopolis, not the movie, had one of these, quote, battlegrounds of a gigantomachy. Solinus wrote that, quote, "Before there were any humans on Pallene, a battle was fought between the gods and giants. Traces of a giant's destruction continue to be seen today. Whenever torrents flood, they say that in the gullies people find bones of immeasurable enormity." And I say it a lot, but like, that's awesome. Yeah, when a flood happens, you know, the fossils emerge from the ground in the valleys and gullies, like, you can see exactly where the fossils inspire these people. The bones in these battlegrounds were dark, and people say they were zapped by Zeus's lightning, and because of this, the battleground remained smouldering. That burnt coloration in reality comes from the bones being buried in lignite. Lignite's also a soft coal, making it highly combustible, and when lit it burns and smokes for years, explaining the idea that it kept smouldering. Again, I've said it a lot, but it's just really cool. A Spartan story says that in 560 BCE, the Oracle of Delphi said that for the Spartans to win a war against Tegea, they needed to bring the bones of the mythical hero Orestes to Sparta. And one day, a Spartan soldier was talking to a smith in Tegea, and the smith admitted to finding bones of a huge skeleton and said, quote, "Men in the past were much bigger than today. I measured the skeleton and it was 7 cubits long. That's about 10 feet, or a bit over 3 meters. And so the Spartan soldier stole the bones and brought them back to Sparta, and the power began to grow. Chances are the bones of Orestes were in fact an old relative of the elephants, the Paleoloxodon. A few other supposed giant bone stories are Ajax's bones, which washed up where Homer's Iliad said he was buried, and these were put in a tomb by the Emperor Hadrian, and were likely a mastodon's bones. Theseus's bones on Skyros in 476 BCE, that were also likely a mastodon's or perhaps a rhino's. The massive shoulder blades of Pelops, who was the legendary founder of the Olympic Games, which was likely the scapula from a woolly mammoth that weighs over 100 pounds. Plutarch in the 1st century CE said the massive bones on Samos were of the legendary Amazons, and so many more. I cannot list them all, but there are tons. Tales of fossils made their way across the Mediterranean even. In 430 BCE, Herodotus in Greece heard tales of remains of flying reptiles in Egypt, and so made a trip to see, quote, "bones and spines in incalculable number, piled in heaps, some big and some small." And these have been suggested to be the fossils of Spinosaurus, which very frequently appear in Egypt. And also in Egypt for thousands of years, they used fossils in amulets, possibly for some sort of magical protections. Over in Malta, a few islands in the middle of the Mediterranean between Italy and Libya, a story goes that in 60 AD St. Paul was shipwrecked there, and the Maltese showed him great kindness, and so he cursed the snakes of the island, resulting in their forked tongues being turned into stone. And this was used to explain the tongue stones that were everywhere, and because of this they could be used as protection against snake bites and poisons. In reality, they were fossilized shark teeth. Pliny the Elder in the 1st century CE, who had lots of his own peculiar ideas, to him they were instead men's tongues that fell from heaven during the eclipses of the moon, and were, quote, thought by the magicians to be very necessary for those that caught fair women. Okay. The most interesting fossil story from the ancient Greeks to me, though, is the monster of Troy. This depiction of a creature on a Corinthian vase from around 560 to 550 BCE that depicts Hesione and Heracles attacking the creature, and it's a weird monster for Greek art, which are amalgams usually, but they look like people or beasts. This does not look like either. The legend goes that the creature appeared on the coast of Troy after a flood, and the prevailing theory by art historians was this depicted the creature hiding in a cave, hence the black mass behind it. But, given when it was painted, which was right around the time that the Spartans had said they discovered the huge bones of Orestes, and the fact that it appeared on the coast after a flood, in fact the same shore where Ajax's bones had been found, is convincing to me that the cliffs were eroded away, making these bones visible, as with Ajax's, and the vase depicts that head emerging from a cliff face, not a cave. Another interesting find relating to Troy introduces one of my least favourite guys, Heinrich Schliemann, who made it his life goal to find the real Troy, and he finds what he thinks it is, and he was right, at Hisarlik in Turkey, and gets the rights to excavate it, and he assumes the Troy from the Iliad would be the layer furthest down. He was wrong. But in his haste, he ended up destroying a bunch of the city he had set out to find. If I could a time machine, I would go back in time and yell at him, because what the hell, man, what's wrong with you? But just moving on. Something that was discovered at this site was the large fossil of a Miocene marine mammal that had been carried there around the time of the Trojan War, and it just makes you wonder what they thought of it exactly, if maybe it inspired the depiction of a monster of Troy on the vase. Though a few paleontologists asked about the depiction on that vase, settled on it possibly being the skull of an extinct giant giraffe, though Adrian Mayer points out there are some amalgamated features like the bony plates around the eyes that a reptile or bird has. But I don't think that detracts from the idea that it's inspired by a fossil because, as mentioned before, Greek monster depictions tended to have some amalgamated elements anyway. Editor's note here, whilst looking for images for this section, I found an article by Julian Monginagira. It was a more recent online survey given to a bunch of paleontologists and biologists looking at this vase, what they thought the creature was, and in this case, less said the giraffe and more said plesiosaurus, or a lizard called Varanus exenthematicus, or a mosasaur. Very few actually said the giraffe, so I thought that was worth noting. This is definitely the shortest section of the video just because I didn't really have access to as many sources as I would like, but it's still really interesting to me, so I thought I'd include what I found anyways. The oldest remains we have of human interaction with fossils that I could find is in East Asia from a cave in the Gobi Desert between the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic, where we found the remains of a dinosaur eggshell drilled with neat little holes in it, and it was used as part of a necklace. And we can't really know what prehistoric people thought these fossils were, but they definitely thought they were valuable, and possibly had some sort of protective qualities, which also shows up in some medieval and a few classical stories. The next big thing probably on your mind is Chinese dragons, very important to, legendary Chinese history. And when I was younger, I was under the assumption that surely they were inspired by dinosaur fossils, but not quite. They were, however, definitely inspired by mammal fossils. In the 2nd century BCE, bones were found during a digging of a canal in northern China, and that led to the place being called Dragon Head Waterway. And I don't think we know what these fossils were, but these dragon teeth and bones appear all the time, and are mostly the remains of Neogene and Pleistocene mammals, and they were believed to have some medicinal properties, especially for diseases of the heart, kidneys, intestines, and liver. The bones and teeth fell from the sky when a dragon was unable to fly back to the heavens due to a lack of clouds. Dragon horns, which were fossilized deer antlers, could also be used in the same way, and the demand for these fossils became so high, in an Imperial Chinese report in 1885 it shows 20 tons of dragon bones were loaded into Chinese ports in 1 year. My favourite Chinese fossil story not related to dragons is when they heard about mammoth remains in Siberia. They believed them to be gigantic underground moles that they called the mouse which hides, and they believed it died whenever it hit the rays of the sun or moon. And I love so much how these stories explain the petrification of the creature into stone, and that's something that shows up a lot in Native American stories. My source for pretty much this entire section is Adrian Mayer's Fossil Legends of the First Americans. She also wrote an article on ancient Greek and Roman fossil stories that I used in this video. And this book is amazing and has so many stories, too many for me to include, so I will be focusing on some Navajo and Iroquois, also known as Haudenosaunee stories. First, various Native American groups in North America have been integral to paleontological history. Some unnamed Native American hunters retrieved some bones for the French in North America on an excursion and took them down to New Orleans, where they were then taken to Paris and put in Louis XV's Cabinet of Curiosities. And they were the first American fossils to be studied by scientists. They are the fossils of the American mastodon. But getting into the stories, south of Albany, New York, on the banks of the Hudson River, enormous bones and teeth were coming out of the ground, large tusks which drew crowds of local Native American groups as well as European colonialists, and the idea of a New World giant started to spread. And local native tales fascinated a poet, Edward Taylor, who wrote some of the local native group stories down. This one comes from the Mohawks, Mohicans, Abenakis, Pequots, and a few others. They said the Claverack remains, belonged to a giant called the Weetugs, or the Mouse-Shops, who lived around 10 generations ago. Assuming one generation is 25 years, then starting from 1700, that'd be around 1450 CE. These giants are described to be as high as the tops of the pine trees, that hunted bears by knocking them out of the branches, and they could wade into the river 12 or 14 feet deep. Edward Taylor goes on to say the tradition among the Indians was that the giants would not hurt the little Indians. It is most likely that these bones were the remains of the American mastodon again. More generally, the large tusks of creatures and other vertebrate fossils that eroded out of the banks of rivers and ponds were seen as the remains of hidden horned water monsters that hide in the depths unseen. David Cusick, a member of the Tuscarora people who are part of a larger Iroquois group, records an Iroquois tradition in 1825 that goes back over 2,000 years, of a great horned monster killed by thunderbolts that appeared on the shore of Lake Ontario, and apparently its stench brought disease. This could perhaps be drawn from the overpowering stink that rotting frozen mammoths emerging from Arctic ice springs. Cusick also mentions some other giants he called the Renong-Wetawane that harassed the early Iroquois thousands of winters ago, and then, after Darwin's publication of the Ideas of Evolution, a Tuscarora historian-in-chief, Elias Johnson, in 1881 suggested that they had gone extinct with the great mammoths in, quote, the Age of Monsters. And both Elias and Cusick agree that the Iroquois had to build strong forts against the creatures, and later on in the 1800s, mastodon fossils were found at the site of a fortified Iroquois village, which I love learning about these connections. Over in Arizona on a Navajo reservation a while ago, paleontologists were excavating the skull of a Pentaceratops, and an old Navajo man came up to see what they were doing, and upon seeing the fossil just said, "Monster Slayer," and then walked away. To explain this, first a bit of traditional Navajo conceptions of the world. It's envisioned as a series of past worlds that were destroyed before the current one, and a few people escaped from these previous worlds, bringing things over from the now dead worlds. The earlier wet and muddy worlds were dominated by monsters which came before the humans, and then when humans came about, they preyed upon the humans. Some monsters in fact pursued the humans into the following worlds, but the sun gave special lightning bolts to the twin sons of Changing Woman so that they could overcome the monsters, and these twins were the Monster Slayers. So let's go over a couple of these monsters they slayed and their likely inspirations. First, the Yaitso, aka the Big Monster, which dwelled in hot springs near Mount Taylor in New Mexico, where many Jurassic and Cretaceous dinosaur fossils have been found. The monsters had a striped face which indicated danger to the Navajo, and its body was covered with scaled armor. It approached the twins with earth-shaking footsteps, and with a fraught battle the twins destroyed it with lightning. And as it crashed, its armor shattered and scattered throughout the land, and its bones, the Yaitso-Bitson, were associated with large dinosaur and marine reptiles, and the Pentaceratops was identified by a Navajo man with this name. The scales and the bony plates of a couple extinct creatures, the Desmatasuchus and Kylosaurus eriops or Stegosaurus, are all objects that are quite clearly seen and found in deserts in North America that could be inspiration for parts of the story, such as the scattering of Yaitso scales. Second, the burrowing monster. Something that looks like a misshapen elk or maybe a huge striped gopher with horns or tusks. And to reach it, the Monster Slayers had to dig tunnels, and that idea had my mind racing. Like, the idea of a group of people coming upon a fossil in the ground and assuming, that's where it lived, is a common interpretation of fossils. Earlier with the Chinese interpretation of Siberian mammoths as underground moles. Or in Alaska, the Yupiks tell of a tusked creature from the underground called Kagapak, that, quote, travels underground, turning to stone when it came into contact with air, which is an awesome explanation for the fossils being stone. I just love it. Also, the Navajo believed that the bones of the giants killed by the Monster Slayers haunted the land they died on, and so when they're uncovered, they believe they're best left alone. For example, in the Great Depression, Navajos working on a government dam uncovered the bones of a phytosaur, this large extinct crocodile, and so they dropped their tools and just left, and refused to work on it. There are so many more stories I want to cover, like ones from medieval England, some from India, some more Native American stories, but I will have to do that at a later date. you want to see that, make sure to subscribe, because hopefully it'll be sooner rather than later. And lastly, I'd like to again thank Adrienne Mayer, who seems to be the person for this topic. Seriously, check out her books. That's all. Bye bye.